can you explain, let's just start off simple. Like, what is HTMX? Welcome again to Backend Banter, the show about backend development and careers. Today, I have an extra special guest. I'm actually really excited for this. I just finished his book. This is Carson Gross, one of the authors of Hypermedia Systems, the book, and most famously, HTMX, the not framework for web development. Carson, do you want to take just a second and introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I know HTMX is a front-end library, and so it's a little bit of an off-topic, I guess, for this podcast. But I do think we'll make it relevant for your listeners when we sort of get into what HTMX is. My name is Carson Gross. I am the creator of HTMX and a few other open source projects. HTMX is definitely the most popular of the bunch, and I teach part-time at Montana State. And then I've got a company called Big Sky Software, which I do my open source work and some consulting and so forth. And been programming for quite some time. I'm probably much older than most of your listeners. I'm closing in on the big 5-0 here, so feel young at heart.
Nice.
But and my Twitter account, I think, punches a lot younger than my actual age does. So we like to have some fun.
The Twitter account is. So I've now read the book. I actually went and stalked you, found you on some other it was like podcasts on YouTube. But the Twitter account, sure. I just was blown away. Couldn't believe it was the same man behind, like the writing style, the memes. It's incredible.
Yeah. Well, I just pick which voice in my head to listen to, and it makes it real easy. It's very easy to switch. So I do get pretty silly on Twitter for sure. But I've been programming for quite some time now. I'm a programmer. I've never really made that jump over to a non-programming role. I've stuck with programming for a long time. And so, I kind of have that, I'd say like late 90s, early 2000s programming ethos where things were a little bit more irreverent and maybe a little less polished than they are these days. So that's definitely stuck with me.
Cool. So I've got you here. Can you explain, let's just start off simple. Like, what is HTMX?
Sure. HTMX is a front-end library, which it's different than most front-end libraries that your listeners are probably used to, in that it is what I call hypermedia oriented. And that's a fancy term, but all it means is that it kind of makes HTML more powerful rather than trying to replace the standard HTML model of the web with what I would call a thick client or a much more heavyweight JavaScript framework. And so rather than managing a lot of code on the front end, a lot of JavaScript code, I should say, on the front end in JavaScript state, instead you just kind of pepper attributes into your HTML that look very symmetric with other standard attributes in HTML, and it makes HTML effectively more powerful. And so that may be of interest to your listeners because it moves a lot of the UI construction, the HTML generation and so forth back onto the back end. And that your web applications become much more like what I would call traditional web applications, where HTML is being returned from the server. And then, you have a form or whatever, and you click a button and it would submit a request and you get back some more HTML. So HTML takes that basic idea of having what I call hypermedia exchanges, or what are hypermedia exchanges, and then makes it more powerful. And it does that really there's four sort of core mechanisms to it. First of all, and I like to say HTMX generalizes HTML. It generalizes, to be sort of nerdy about it, it generalizes what are known as hypermedia controls, which are the funny things that make hypermedia special and make HTML special, but things like links and forms, those are the two major ones in HTML. And what's interesting about those two things is that they embed behavior in the document. And so HTMX takes that idea of embedding behavior in the document and generalizes it. So you can have any element listen for any event and issue any type of HTTP request. So get, post, put, patch, or delete. And then the real crux, I think, of HTMX and what makes it a viable solution for a lot of web applications is that it allows you to place the returned HTML content anywhere on the screen. And then it gives you a few different ways you can do that. Like you can append it somewhere, or you can replace something, or replace the inner HTML of something, and so forth.
So earlier you said that this is a front end library, and it's kind of weird. Like this is backend banter, right? We talk about backend, but I think HTMX is uniquely interesting, like you said, to backend developers because it takes the responsibility of building the UI and kind of throws it back on the backend developers. Because as you said, we're kind of injecting snippets of HTML back into the front end, which the first time I read about HTMX, I thought it was insanity. I was like, wait, hold on. You want me to take raw data, which is like my like stomping ground as a backend developer, right? Like just raw JSON data, whatever. And I could ship it back to the front end, wash my hands of it and say, you guys deal with how to present it to the user. And you want me to dynamically generate HTML and not only generate like a page, but generate little snippets and shove it into the page. Yep. Like I thought it was bonkers. As I read the book, it started to make a lot more sense. So, okay, we've gone over a little bit about what HTMX is in the sense that it generates HTML, it injects it in the page. You have the ability to use all the HTTP verbs directly in your templates. Let's talk a little bit about the philosophy behind it. Why would I ever do this? Again, to someone that's done backend development for the last 10 years, this seems crazy.
Yeah, no, I know it does because the standard now is sort of what you've just outlined, which is the backend produces JSON and then the front end consumes that JSON, and the front end is a JavaScript framework based application. And there, you know, that isn't a bad architecture, but it's different, and it's different than what the web was at first. The web really was in contrast. So I would call that a thick client architecture. Like if you think about it at the network architecture level, that is a backend that's producing a data API. And then you have a thick client on the front end that's consuming that data API. And that's very much like applications were built pre-web. You know, in the 1980s, there were a lot of applications that were built like this. They were native applications often, or almost always, but they did something very similar, and they used Corba or whatever, some sort of remote protocol with a remote system. So that's the way the web application industry has sort of trended over the last decade. The web was really a reaction against that, and the idea there was that you had I don't want to call it a thin client because web browsers are not thin; they're very sophisticated, but they're built to be hypermedia clients. And a hypermedia client is a client that can understand hypermedia of some sort. So HTML browsers understand HTML. And what's really interesting and unique about that is that the browser, in a way that is not true of like old 1980s style thick applications, is that a browser is really a universal client in that you can take your browser and you can point it at a dog, you know, a dog store or an automobile store or an airline ticket store, you know, site or whatever. And it can talk to all of those using this universal language, the hypermedia language. And the HTML provides this mechanism where you can implement any sort of application on top of it. And so that was all kind of, that it was recognized when the web was being built that was a unique aspect of it. And so Roy Fielding coined this term REST when he described that web architecture. Now, your listeners may think REST, JSON APIs, because somewhat ironically, REST has come today to just mean JSON APIs over HTTP. And I have an essay up on the HTMX website. You can find it at htmx.org/essays called "How Did REST Come to Mean the Opposite of REST?" But again, somewhat ironically, the original meaning of REST was lost, and it was turned into, you know, what again is probably the standard today, these JSON APIs. So what was good about the web when compared with thick applications? Well, first of all, you had this universal client that's pretty interesting and different than the earlier thick applications. The other thing that's really powerful in my mind is what's called the uniform interface of HTML, which is that when you go to a website, you go to some new shopping website, the browser doesn't know about any of the endpoints for that website. And instead, what happens is you get HTML, and the HTML within it has links and forms and so forth that allow you to interact with the backend for that new web application. And that's called this general idea is called the uniform interface, and it's very flexible, because what that means is if that web application changes in some way, say they add a new category or whatever, a new subset of functionality, you just see that in the web app as a link, a new tab or whatever it is, and you click on that, and then you can start interacting with that web app with that new functionality. And because the HTML encodes all of the network endpoints, there's this flexibility where you don't have to download a new client. Like the client is being delivered to you via Hypermedia sort of continuously. And that makes versioning of Hypermedia-driven applications much easier than, for example, JSON-based applications that are using JSON as an API, where API versioning becomes much more difficult.
Right. The thing that really struck me, again, especially when I was reading the book, and in the first couple chapters, you kind of outline the philosophy behind HTMX, is that like HTMX is decoupled, but in a just completely different way, right?
Yeah.
When I started building web applications, the idea was we're going to decouple between like the data, like the model and the controller, and the view, right? So like as a backend developer, I'm just concerned with data and how I surface it to the client, usually via JSON. It doesn't have to be JSON,
Yeah.
but like that's a pretty convenient way to do it. And then the client can like worry about parsing that data and showing it on the page. When I
Mm-hmm.
first read about HTMX, I was like, this is a huge problem. Like, this is a fully coupled system, right? Like, now as a backend developer, I have to be very concerned about what product wants, where they want buttons, what they want the buttons exactly to do, where they show up on the page. But there is an interesting decoupling going on there, like you said, in that, now that the backend controls all the logic, for example, I no longer need to update two applications every time like a data endpoint changes, for example.
Yep.
Um, can you talk a little bit more about why, like, A, do you think that decoupling is a more important decoupling? And if so, is it in all cases?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And there's another essay up on. I'm going to point interested listeners to the essays tab on the htmx.org
Yeah.
website. There's an essay called Two Style. I think it's called Two Styles of Decoupling. So just as you pointed out, JSON decouples the front end from the back end at the application layer. So the application developer is making that decision. We're going to decouple these two things. I'm going to present a generic API, and that's it. Whereas with Hypermedia, your responses are tightly coupled to your UI, right? There's just no you're returning your UI at some level, and so yes, you're tightly coupled. But what Hypermedia does is it moves the decoupling down a layer to the network architecture. So because of this thing that I keep calling the uniform interface, because the data, the user interface data that's coming down encodes all of the network interactions within it, you get this decoupling where you don't have to worry about versioning your Hypermedia API as like you do with a data API. And so what that means is that you can tune a particular endpoint for a particular UI use case, and it's fine. Like you're not going to hurt anything else because you're producing the UI for it. JSON, on the other hand, does decouple better at the application level. But then I think one thing you and your listeners are probably familiar with are these complaints from JSON API engineers where they're asked to add UI specific components to API responses, right? And you end up building this JSON API response that's like just for a screen because they don't want to make a bunch of different calls. And so you end up often encoding data that's like to support a particular part of your application, or maybe you end up adopting something like GraphQL to try and make things more general for your front end developers. And what both of those situations are indicating is that there appears to be an inherent coupling between your application and your data, driven mainly by performance needs. Presenting a generic data API over the network is either going to be complex, like in the case of GraphQL, and there's a lot of security issues. I don't know if you want to get into that, but there's a lot of security issues with the way GraphQL is typically presented, or you
Right.
end up producing very specialized JSON APIs. So my contention is that the hypermedia mechanism for decoupling, the lower level network layer, actually does a better job in the long run of supporting change. Now, that doesn't make Hypermedia a good general purpose data API. It's a very bad general purpose data API. And another essay
Yeah.
I point to is talks about splitting your Hypermedia API up from your JSON, your general data API, splitting those into two separate projects that use the same domain logic. Hopefully you have a model, some sort of model sitting behind all this, so you can reuse logic between the two. But they're just very different approaches to building software. So I think, in practice, the fact that JSON APIs are so often kind of butchered for app specific needs, or you have to take this huge complexity jump to GraphQL indicates that the decoupling that is often presented as a benefit of JSON data APIs isn't. It often doesn't really work out that way.
It's so interesting because essentially what you're saying is like, yes, explicitly a JSON data API might be decoupled, but in practice it just kind of becomes coupled inherently. And I've found that to
Yeah.
be true in a lot of areas of software development where we like come up with this kind of like nice general rule for doing something. And it's like, oh, we should do it because it's like dry code, or we should do it because it's decoupled. And then like you start doing it and you realize that like in a perfect world with infinite resources, that might work really well. But for the sake of simplicity, which I would argue is like the number one thing you should be optimizing for at most companies, it just doesn't work like that in practice.
Yeah. There's, I think a big part of it's the network latency. Like you want to minimize. You've got this UI that's being fundamentally driven by data that's living somewhere else, and so you want to really tune your responses for that UI. And if you have a JSON, just a generic JSON API, that can be really difficult to do properly. And it introduces, there's other issues, like it introduces this wall where now I'm a front end developer and I need to do a screen, and I've got to put in a ticket for a back end engineer to do the thing to make it work, and then he's got to get 2 sprints later he does it and it comes back to me and I forget what I'm doing. And all of that human sort of friction can go away if you just say, look, I'm just going to produce I'm going to work on the back end, I'm going to use SQL because we're allowed to use something like SQL on the back end. You can't give, this is what I was kind of mentioning about security issues, you can't give SQL to front end developers. You can give approximations of SQL, but they really have to be locked down pretty tight, or you're going to have a lot of security
Yeah.
issues to front end developers. But back end developers, because you're in a trusted computing environment, because you're on a server that you control, it's not just in a browser where there's a console that any idiot can open up and start, firing queries against. On the back end, you're allowed to have something like SQL. And so, if you know a little bit of SQL and you know a little bit of HTML, and maybe learn some HTMX, you can actually be very efficient and eliminate that loop between the front end and back end engineers, so that you have to argue about whether or not something belongs in an API. We've got to version the thing and all that kind of stuff. It all goes away, and you can have a much smoother and faster feedback cycle as you build out these front end, these components of your front end.
Right. And so to give like just a really concrete example of this like GraphQL like heavily flexible data API. I worked a lot with the Facebook API years ago. So we had this social media application, right? It was social media analytics essentially, and it would reach out to Facebook, the Facebook GraphQL API, frequently to get data. And the very tricky thing is that Facebook uses GraphQL. They're kind of the inventors of GraphQL, and they use a GraphQL API to expose their data publicly to like third-party applications. and it's an extremely flexible JSON-based API. The problem is you can shoot yourself in the foot really easily because you're allowed to ask for any data, and the backend will just like kind of compute that data. You're not
Yeah.
charged on like a request model like a lot of API providers would charge you, right? Like, I don't know, $10 per million requests or something like that. They charge you based on compute. So if you happen to request a data structure that requires an immense amount of compute on their end, you can actually eat through your entire rate limit in like a single request, and you just sit there for 20 seconds waiting for a response, which to
Yeah.
me is like uh, the end result of that at scale.
Right. Well, and even worse than that, a malicious user who realizes you're using the Facebook API can open up a console and do whatever they want. You know, like they can
Right.
craft
Yeah.
a really psychotic GraphQL thing that returns, you know, or they can just write a for whatever it is, you know, like it gets really, it gets really ugly. And there's a reason why, you know, we don't give the front end general data access. And so I think I don't want to say it's a losing battle, but GraphQL is. I got into a fight back when GraphQL came out with one of the creators, as Josh Hunt, maybe, on Hacker News. It was like, dude, this is crazy. Like, you know, you can't give people this much stuff, this much power on the front end. Any expressive power you put in the hands of your front end developers in the console is available also to malicious users. So, like, I guess that's my one
Right.
sentence summary of the problem. So, you're going to always have this tension between, okay, I really don't want to deal with changes from the front end, and so I'm going to give this person expressive power, who's my front end developer. But then standing right behind him, menacingly, is an evil user that is getting that expressive power as well. And, you know, even if you don't return things like salary or whatever, you can like accidentally let people sort by salary if there's like, you know, like all sorts of very subtle things like that. That's like, you know, you really got to think pretty hard to get that right. And that's in contrast with SQL on the back end, where, you know, yeah, SQL injection attacks are an issue, but it's sort of a solved problem. And you can, to a first order approximation anyways, give a back end developer access to SQL and the ability to build HTML and not have to worry about that power leaking into the front end to the user. It's not perfect, of course, nothing is, but it's certainly much more comfortable in my mind than giving SQL to the front end.
Right. So instead of returning generalized data APIs that are extremely flexible, I would assume I've never actually built an HTMX application completely from scratch, but that you don't have to think about as many edge cases either, because it seems to me that you'd be designing for a very explicit UI. So, like, to give an example, a lot of times when I'm building a backend API, I have to think like, okay, I know that the front end team, or I know that myself, when working on the front end code, is going to consume my JSON API in this way, but I'm going to go ahead and just make it a little bit more flexible, just in case I want to change it down the road.
Yep.
So it requires just a little more thought, a little more generalization, and as you pointed out, that can lead to security concerns. Whereas it seems
Yeah.
to me if you're building an HTMX powered application, you're going to be much more explicit in how you build the backend endpoints.
Yep, exactly. And the API, and this is why you need to split your Hypermedia API and your general data API. So if you have that need for a general data API, that needs to be built separately from your Hypermedia API,
Right.
from the HTML based application that you're building. And that's because in an HTMX based application, your URLs tend to be driven by your user interface rather than by sort of the way we've come to think about RESTful quote unquote URLs, where they're sort of driven by the domain and, you know, and so forth. It's the hypermedia, a hypermedia driven application that uses HTMX. The URLs are going to be very much driven by UI needs, and they're going to be allowed to change dramatically as UI needs change. That's the power of hypermedia, is
Right.
that you can do that. You can just tear out an endpoint because we don't link to it anymore, and that's it. Now it's done. There's no versioning or anything like that. And so So it's a very different way of thinking about things. It's much more direct, I find, and I think that's sort of what you're getting at. You don't have to plan for the future quite so much, and you can react more quickly and more flexibly to UI changes, which I think is a really good thing. The essay is called "Splitting Your Data and Application APIs" on the HTMX page, and I talk about that. Like, you just have different needs. If you have a general purpose data API, for third-party consumers or maybe a mobile app or whatever, it's just going to have a different shape, data access shape, and so you're going to want things like rate limiting and a nice general API, maybe GraphQL if it's a very sophisticated one, so forth. Whereas your application API is very specific to exactly what your application does. So Hypermedia gives you that flexibility to build that just the way you want.
Yeah. That's what I was going to ask, was like, when do you go about creating that separate JSON API? Obviously, third-party mobile apps could be a big one, right? Because your mobile app probably is not just a web client. I say probably because that is also a trend that we've seen. But
Yeah.
it probably needs like just strict data access. Third-party APIs, like you said, maybe if you're building a product like Stripe, your customers actually need to consume raw data rather than
Right.
like data encoded as HTML. Is that a problem? Like, have you seen it become an issue where now I have to like duplicate all of my endpoints?
I have not. I've always done that. I've been doing that since 2010 because I had intercooler JS, way back then. And every single project I've ever started, I immediately build a web app. And then as soon as there's a third party integration, I build a JSON app. And because I collect my domain logic in a model, in model objects, it's typically not very complicated. The biggest app that I have built it was with Intercooler.js, which is the predecessor to HTMX, had a generic JSON API, which it was a fairly standard REST, what today would be called RESTful API with sort of nice URLs and all, rate limiting and all the rest of it, and it was maybe 300 lines of code, and we never touched it, and it just delegated out to the model. So it shared all the domain logic, all the validation logic, and all that stuff was in the model. And so it was not a big issue for us.
Right.
I don't know every, backends setup and how difficult that is to do. This was in Rails. So Rails has a very strong notion of models, which helped probably. But it wasn't difficult for me to manage. So I didn't find it an issue. But, I'm also used to it. So hard to say.
Yeah. I've noticed that I noticed that the book, all of the examples were written in Python, I think specifically Flask. Mm-hmm. Do you primarily write Python and Flask these days, or are you still doing Rails?
I write no Python or Flask ever. I had to learn Flask and Python. It's funny because HTMX really got picked up by the Django community. If I was just following who uses HTMX at the time of writing the book, I would definitely have used Django. But I ended up using Flask because Flask is a little bit simpler and a little bit more of a direct map between URLs and the code getting executed. Django is much more featureful, more like Rails in some ways. It's a much thicker piece of software, and that comes with good and bad. So I felt like it would take readers longer to pick up exactly what was going on. And so I decided to use Python because Python is the most popular programming language, even though I don't use it very much. And then Flask because it was the simplest way I could find to do the mapping. And I'd used Flask a couple times before. So I typically program in Java, believe it or not. That's what I am mostly programming.
Oh no. Get this guy out of here.
I know.
All right.
I'm old. I'm just an old person, and that's most of my classes, like my compilers class, I teach in Java and so forth. So I've got a lot of problems with.
Never seen you admit that on Twitter. Probably for good
no,
reason.
no. I've admitted it on Twitter, but I definitely keep it pretty. I don't brag about it very much.
Okay, cool. So, all right. So, I mean, the great thing about HTMX at the end of the day is it does work with any backend. It's almost a philosophy of how you build your backend code. And then obviously there is this JavaScript client that gets loaded into the browser. But like any backend language, any backend framework, you're going to be able to do HTMX. You mentioned that, okay, so you've got the JSON API, you've got the HTML API in some applications. Let's just assume we're building a web application that has a mobile app. So you've got your mobile app and your kind of web app version. So you're using HTMX to power the web app, JSON API to power the mobile app. And you mentioned that you were able to kind of deduplicate a lot of logic. Now you used two words. I think you said model and controller. Could you just like very quickly explain how you break up your code so that you don't have like a lot of duplicate logic? Say, for example, like the filtering of rows from a table maybe that you want to respond to the client with.
Sure. Yeah. So those are two components of the general pattern, which is model view controller. And that's a pattern that was, it's been around forever in computer science. And it's the idea that you should break your system up when you have a user interface into three sort of areas of concern. So this is sort of a separation of concerns argument. And those are the model, which is the data model, the domain model, the actual objects that model your particular problem. And that's where the majority of logic should live. That's, tied to whatever it is you're doing. So if you're a dog food store, then you would expect there to be like dog food brands and so forth. It's a little biased towards object-oriented programming, but, I think a functional mapping works as well. And then you have the view, and the view in the case of HTMX is HTML, just producing HTML. So that's whatever produces your HTML is your view. And then you have a controller layer, and that controller layer is responsible for taking requests from the network and mapping them into the model. And in the Rails community, there's this notion of thick models and skinny controllers, I think is the terminology they use, or thin controllers. And basically, your controller layer ends up being these little snippets of code that just take a URL and then immediately delegate out to the model to do something, and then immediately delegate out to a view system, like a template system in the case of HTMX is the common one, to produce a view based on the results of that call to the model. And then you return that to the client. That's sort of the canonical controller code. And so if you've gathered most of your logic for sorting and so forth, all the database-y type stuff or data store type stuff in your model, then it's very easy to have a controller that's geared towards, for example, your HTMX app that's producing HTML, but then also a set of controllers for your JSON API that invoke the same model classes that have the vast majority of your domain logic in them. And just produce JSON. It was popular at one point in Rails to reuse an HTML or HTTP, sort of pushes this idea a little bit, where you can ask for you can negotiate a content type with a particular URL. So you can say, okay, I want, for example, like some website.com/users/3, and it'll produce the UI for user 3. And then you can say with a header that I'd like JSON instead, and it'll produce a JSON representation instead. My experience with that is that the shape of your URLs tends to fight. they tend, it's good to break them up into two separate projects and have two separate sets of URLs, because just because the URLs of your hypermedia driven application tend to just be focused on UI needs rather than general domain needs. And so my experience with that idea of using content negotiation has not been great. That's why I've always split them out into two different things, and then relied on the fact that I've got a good model that has my domain logic in it in order to reuse code between the two sets of URLs.
That makes sense, because like you might have 27 URLs that return HTML or HTMX and only 15 for like generalized data, right? It seems weird that the assumption would be that you could couple them one-to-one.
Yeah, your data API tends to be very regular. It's like it's just has the same pattern for all the objects that are in your domain and so forth. Whereas your UI, like if you need to make some component of your UI lazy loaded, for example, which is a pattern that you can implement in HTMX very easily. Then you've got to pull out another URL for that lazy loaded content and then set up your request and blah, blah, blah. And that doesn't make any sense for a JSON API. Like that's
Right.
driven by the UI. And so you don't want to
Yeah.
mix those two together in my experience. I find it better to just separate them out and pay it's a little bit of a cost of maintaining this other thing, but data APIs, once you get them right, they shouldn't change that often. And if you remove the chaos of your front end application from the JSON API, it can just sit there and be a good data API, much more and live a
Right.
lot longer and happier life.
Yeah, and it's not allowed to have those assumptions, right? Like again, I think of like Stripe as an example of this. It's an API for essentially subscriptions and credit cards, and like they just literally cannot make assumptions about your UI because they're serving data for millions of different apps, right? So they have to be pretty much
Yep.
as general purpose as they can be. Um,
Yeah.
which makes a lot of sense. Okay, so just to like, I want to recap what you said about MVC and how you're like currently not duplicating all that much logic between the JSON and the HTMX APIs, because you said you push a lot of the logic up to the model, and a lot of my
Mm-hmm.
audience are most familiar with Python and even more specifically Go. And in Go,
Okay.
for example, you'd probably have two different HTTP handler functions, one for like the JSON version of an endpoint, one for the HTMX version. And I'm thinking what would make the most sense is to have like very generalized functions or methods that operate on the database and return like a set of raw data. And both of those
Sure.
functions would call that exact same like inner function, if that makes sense. And then the
Yeah.
inner function would probably pass its data in the HTMX version to like a templating function, or in the
Right.
case of the JSON API, might not even need to do much other than just like parse it into a JSON structure and return it. Would that be the equivalent of like what's happening in the MVC Rails world and like something in in a like a Go programming language?
Yeah, I think where we're struggling with here is the object oriented versus the functional like concepts. And
Yeah.
so I'm not super familiar with Go, unfortunately. I know a little bit about it, but yeah, I would expect there to be a controller layer which would have two separate sets of endpoint mappings, one for JSON APIs that would live in one place and one for your Hypermedia API that would be at a different route effectively. And then I would expect requests that went into those controller methods to issue a request to talk through functions or through objects if Go supports object-oriented programming, but to talk to something that had a name that was associated with what your business was doing. So, in the case of like the pet food store, vendors, I would expect there to be in this abstract notion of vendor, and it would do a thing with the vendor, maybe get all the vendors or paged, whatever it is, and then that method would be reused in both your controller methods, your JSON API controller method, as well as your Hypermedia application API. You would invoke that method, you would get back this list of vendors, and then the JSON API, all it would need to do is serialize that as JSON, which hopefully is a very simple and generic mechanism for doing that. Whereas in the Hypermedia API, you would typically delegate to some sort of template, some HTML template language. And my understanding is the Go has a very nice baked in version of string
Yeah.
templating. And so you would just use that, produce HTML, and return that to the client. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of duplication there, but those things, again, because of the endpoint chaos that comes along with applications, it appears to be inherently part of web applications. You separate the two, and then your JSON API can stay nice and stable and require not too much maintenance because you're not versioning it all the time and messing with it. Instead, you're doing the majority of your churn is over in the Hypermedia application, which is designed to handle that sort of stuff, designed to handle the chaos
Right.
of application development.
That sounds exactly how I would build it in Go. Go is my primary language of choice. I have a question. Have you seen increased interest in HTMX specifically from the Go community in the last like year or so? I know a lot of Go developers have been talking about it online.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't. So when I meant to mention this earlier, but one of the things you were talking about, oh, with HTMX, you can use it with any backend. Well, someone might say, oh, okay, sure, but I can use React with any backend too, right? And that's
Yeah.
true. However, with HTMX, it pushes the focus way more onto the backend. And so whatever backend tool you're using, you're going to be able to use a lot more because you're not just producing a generic JSON API. You're actually producing the UI. And so it puts a focus. So if you want to write Go, or you want to write Haskell or OCaml or Julia or Lisp or whatever, you're going to write a lot more of it. And in a lot of these languages, they have HTML or HTML builders like integrated in the language, and everything can be in the language that you want to use rather than having to use any sort of templating at all. And so it really does give people who are passionate about a particular programming language like Go the opportunity to work in that language much more intensely, but also still participate and kind of build an entire application themselves rather than being reduced to just producing a generic JSON API and then fighting with front end engineers about what the shape of that JSON API should be. I think
Right.
I think Go developers are finding out about it, and because they're passionate about Go, it's an opportunity to kind of cut out the middleman, maybe do some front end development if they've been interested in that without the complexity of, okay, now I've got to learn JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever to deal with this front end. So one thing I like about HTMX is it's, probably about 5 years ago, it seemed pretty inevitable that everyone was going to be writing JavaScript on the back end or TypeScript or something, because when you have a big front end code base in JavaScript, there's a tremendous amount of pressure to adopt JavaScript on the back end, because why have two languages? Why have two build systems? Why have two implementations of
Right.
domain logic? Why not just implement it in JavaScript on the back end, and then you can use that same logic on the front end and all this. So there's just all this pressure. And HTMX, I'm happy to say, I hope that this isn't bragging, but I think is taking that pressure off so that people who are passionate about Go, for example, can participate in web development as sort of full members and not have this giant JavaScript code base pushing on them, just kind of wearing them out to the point that they say,
Yeah.
fine, we'll use TypeScript just because at least it has types, but fine, we'll just use it. You
Yeah.
can stay in Go or you can stay in OCaml or whatever, and still be a web developer, quote unquote.
I see HTMX as like the liberator. We've been shackled to JavaScript for so long. And, Node.js probably wouldn't even exist in its current form if it wasn't for this pressure that you're alluding to, right? Like, I have
Yep.
to write JavaScript. Like every web development shop out there, it's just been like, well, we are writing JavaScript because we have to, because we've been forced that way by the way browser clients are designed. So do we write JavaScript everywhere, or do we write JavaScript plus something? And obviously in my career, it's always been JavaScript plus something. Just because I've been in the Go community. But there's
Mm-hmm.
always been this idea of like, well, are we all eventually just going to write JavaScript? So it's really
Yep.
refreshing to me to see that we can take languages. There's so many, very few people I've found are actually passionate about JavaScript. Uh, like very few people, other than just the ones that like learned it first and and just want to write it because they know it. Very few people will
Yep.
out themselves as JavaScript lovers. So
Yeah.
no,
There are
I'm very
some, the front
happy
end.
with the current state of affairs.
Yeah, the real
Go
heavy,
ahead, sorry.
the big time front end. Now, the big time front end people are and Rich Harris, for example, he wrote a he wrote had a it wasn't an essay, it was a talk he gave about have SPAs ruin the web, I think was the title of it. So you can look that up on YouTube and watch it. And one of the
Yeah.
things he talks about in there is the JavaScript resistance. And he's a JavaScript oriented person, and in that talk he asserts that edge computing is going to be what kills the remaining JavaScript resistance, and everyone will end up writing JavaScript because of that. I don't agree with that, and I have an essay. This is so often the case. I have an essay on htmx.org, sort of going through and talking about the points he makes, and I hope being reasonable, but also refuting the ones I don't agree with. And I think that's something I just don't want to see that. Like, I'm not a Go programmer, but I think it would be really awful if Go couldn't be a thing just because it's not JavaScript, or Haskell or Lisp, even more so. Like, there's a chance I may become a Go developer at some point in my life, but there is almost zero chance I'm going to become a Lisp developer. But I want Lisp to exist. I want there to be Lisp people who are sitting around telling us we're all doing programming wrong. That's that diversity. That diversity of programming languages is something that I appreciated about the early web. We had Perl and just all these crazy stuff going on. And I don't want to see the web become this homogenous sort of environment where everyone just has to write JavaScript or maybe TypeScript if JavaScript just ends up being too crazy. So yeah, it's something I really like about HTMX, and I hope HTMX helps people participate in the web in their preferred programming language. I like the chaos.
Yeah. Has anyone spun the narrative, or have you spun the narrative with like Rich Harris as Darth Vader trying to squash the resistance, and HTMX, the horse with laser eyes, being the Luke Skywalker in the hero's journey?
I've always identified with the bad guys more than the good guys, so I feel more like Grand Admiral Thorn. What's that guy's name? There's the books. The books are really good. There was the bad guy after like the fall of the Empire. Grand Admiral Thorn, I think. Okay. So I don't know. Rich seems like a really nice guy, and I don't want to pin Darth Vader on him. I think HTMX is the bad guy here, but there's the heart of gold underneath the villain's mask. So.
Yeah, I need to have Rich on later to argue the other side. I would just be so sad if he's right, because like just inherently, like JavaScript comes along with like dynamic typing and like performance issues that I just don't want to see us all as web developers kind of shackled to that. Like, I do think it works for certain use cases, but I like the freedom.
Yeah, and I don't want to be too hard on Rich. Like, I understand his perspective, and I think he's a very sharp guy. Svelte, however you say it, is his thing, and it's an excellent front end library. And I think there are times when it's definitely appropriate. I just think there are times when hypermedia can be appropriate as well if you increase the expressive power of HTML, which is what HTMX does. So, he's a reasonable guy. I don't know if he's blocked me on Twitter. I've come in pretty hot on a couple of threads of his. And so, Rich, if you're listening, it's all good. I'm just, messing around being silly on Twitter. And I definitely appreciate his technical contributions to web development.
Yeah. For the record, Svelte is very cool. It kind of competes with like the real Galactic Empire, which is like React in the web development space. So I have a question surrounding like where you'd like to see HTMX go, because as I was reading through the book, and obviously HTMX, so I don't know if we've explicitly stated this enough during the podcast for people that are new to HTMX, but HTMX doesn't require you to write JavaScript. Like, it's a JavaScript library that you access through HTML. So the great thing about HTMX is if you're a backend developer, you generate a template of HTML, you ship it to the front end, and you're done. As long as the HTMX JavaScript exists within the browser, it adds the functionality to the HTML template to allow certain things to happen. So as I was reading the book, I was thinking to myself, well, this is just a direction that browsers should have taken. Like, they should have just supported all the HTTP verbs, and they should just allow you to inject snippets of HTML into a already rendered DOM. Is that what you'd like to see eventually, this standardized and just shipped with clients?
Yeah, I think HTMX is how HTML should have evolved as a hypermedia. So one of the things I complain about in the book is that HTML hasn't really advanced very much as a hypermedia. It's improved quite a bit. HTML5 had a lot of features in it, but all those features were for the most part focused on sort of front end only needs. So like validation and playing video, like stuff that's not really hypermedia. And in the book and also in some of the essays, I sort of go through and say, well, if we generalize this idea of hypermedia controls, we can do a lot more with HTML and not need any JavaScript. And it would be absolutely fantastic for me in my life if the burden of maintaining HTMX, which it's not that bad. At the end of the day, it's only like 3,000 lines of JavaScript, and it's not changing that much. But still, it just feels like it's something that should be part of HTML. And so I joke around a lot. I applied to be the CEO of the W3C as a joke. I don't understand. My understanding is that the control over HTML is actually in the hands of the browser people now. And I do have, I have an email relationship with some of the Google engineers on the Chrome team. And so I think they're starting to see, okay, this is something that could potentially be part of HTML itself. But I would love it if HTMX was eventually folded into HTML and I didn't have to maintain this library anymore. I could work on other stuff.
Yeah.
It does, again, it just seems pretty obvious to me, if you just take a step back and think about how does HTML work? What is a hypermedia control? Like what's the commonality between a link and a form, and then you put those two together, you end up with something very much like HTMX. I wouldn't expect the browsers to adopt the HTMX API, but the ideas, and I've said this before, I think the ideas that HTMX, like the essays page on the HTMX website is probably more important in the long run than HTMX, the implementation. There are going to be a lot of, it's a simple idea. I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of other implementations. There are already, if you've heard of turbo.dev, that's the 37 signals, kind of similar in many ways to HTMX. I don't think it's as focused. It's a little bit more brandy. It's branded to their sort of like style of development, where HTMX, I feel like, does a pretty good job of, we're generalizing HTML. And so, that's makes it a little lower level and a little bit more work in some cases. It's not quite as magic, but it is much, I think it's a good base technology to look at if you're thinking about, okay, what do we want to do with HTML as a hypermedia? And like, how do we want to advance it? So.
Well, I see it as the perfect experiment. Like if you rewind 10, 15 years, jQuery added a bunch of functionality to essentially DOM manipulation, right? And eventually a lot of those sorts of implementations, or I shouldn't say exactly implementations, but like the functionality that you were getting from jQuery is often now just native in the browser. So you don't really need the library.
Yep.
And, the library comes with not only competing libraries, so you don't know which one to choose, but it also sometimes comes with performance drawbacks, right? Like you actually have to ship the library down to everyone's machine when they load the page. So I see HTMX as this amazing experiment. Like, let's get people using it. Do we like it? What do we like about the implementation? What do we not like about the implementation? Then it can get standardized in the browser, ship with the browser, and now you also overcome those performance hurdles, which I think is a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. And so we've tried to keep HTMX pretty minimalist. So it's about, I think it's about 14K compressed and minimized now. So it loads pretty quickly. But that focus on being an extension to HTML, I think has really helped keep the library pretty small. And then I think, again, because we're focusing on extending HTML, I think it has a good or a better shot of being adopted, at least the ideas, in the browsers in the long run. It just, once you see this idea of, generalized hypermedia controls, of course, like we just need to generalize the event, the type of the request, and then where we stick the result. And that's really all you need to do. Then I think it has a chance of eventually working its way into the browser implementation. So, and that would be much better.
Have you thought about the relationship between HTMX and what have been released in the last few years with native web components?
I haven't done too much digging into it. I know some people have, and my experience. I looked at web components probably about 2 years ago, and they just felt too. It was too heavy, and I couldn't make them quite work quite right. But I do know some people have looked into it. What I always say with HTMX and any other technology. So maybe you want to use React for an island of interactivity, which is the terminology people use. If you got some part of your web app where Hypermedia just isn't going to get it done, so you need something more serious like React. Anytime you have a piece of technology that's living alongside HTMX, the way to integrate it with HTMX is going to be via events. And so I would expect if people are building out web components, that the way that those will interact well, if they're going to interact well with HTMX, it's going to be via events because HTMX is set up to respond to events and issue requests in response to events. And so the DOM is actually a really cool piece of technology in that it's a hierarchical event bus. It's this crazy thing, right? Where you can trigger an event on a node and it'll bubble up to the parent and you can listen anywhere in the tree and so on and so forth. And so that's how I would expect in the long run if web components integrate well with HTMX, it's going to be via those events.
The standard DOM eventing. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
When are the like? Can you give me an example of an application that you wouldn't build with HTMX? I can think of a billion that you would, but like, when would you not?
Sure. I think a good example, and there's an essay called "When to Use Hypermedia" on the website. But I think a great example is Google Maps. Google Maps involve reacting to mouse moves. And that is something, a mouse move, like there's too many of them, and you can't issue a network request and get back the updated state in a way that's fast enough to implement a good user experience with that. And so I would not implement something like Google Maps with HTMX. On the other hand, if there's a settings page in Google Maps, that's probably more like a standard form. And so that might be an opportunity where you can use HTMX. And because it's not, replacing the whole page, it might be easier to use HTMX for that little part of the app, just for your settings, slide out or whatever it is, and save yourself a lot of complexity versus using whatever crazy JavaScript library you're using to manage map state. Also for what's at the end of the day a pretty straightforward form. So that's I think a good example. Or like a game. Anytime when a network request is just not acceptable, And I do think network requests. Right. I mean, network connections are pretty fast these days, except there's the Australia problem and all that sort of stuff. But you can interact with a backend fairly frequently, and it's not as bad as it sounds. Particularly with HTMX, when you have a relatively small snippet of code coming back that's being processed pretty quickly, you're not reloading like all the ad tech and all the tracking and all the there's just not a lot being reloaded. Your applications can be very snappy with a network request and a hypermedia network request, but still, I think you need to. That's to me when people are like, "Oh, I wouldn't use." I often hear, "Oh, I wouldn't use HTMX for something complicated. Maybe for something simple." And to me, it's not how complicated your application is. Rather, it's how complicated your user interface is. You could have a very sophisticated application that uses all sorts of AI and stuff like that on the back end to do, very crazy domain logic. And that's fine as long as the interaction with the back end can be relatively straightforward. And in that case, HTMX is a fine choice, even if you have a very sophisticated application. But if you have, even a simple game that's like, dragging, if you're dragging the screen around or using your mouse for input or something like that, that's not going to work well with HTMX just because network requests not going to be okay.
Right. And to be clear, because I'm not sure if a lot of our listeners will be familiar with exactly this problem, but like some front end applications will like preload data, and then like on the mouse click, the screen will change, but they didn't have to like go get more data. They like already got the data from the back end. And so they're just like updating the DOM, the document object model, as you click around. So it feels like, well, it is basically instantaneous. Whereas with HTMX, we still don't need full page refreshes. We can still just inject little changes in the page, but there is a request being sent to a backend server, which, could take anywhere from, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 milliseconds up to,
Right.
half a second or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So you
Cool.
just, to me, when I think about HTMX, it's more, okay, what does my UI need to do? Like the closer it is to a CRUD style app where it's just you got forms and images and text and you're just updating parts of the screen, maybe, the better it's going to perform. And the further it gets away from that, the harder it's going to be to use just HTMX. But maybe you put an HTMX frame around a richer island of interactivity that's implemented using web components or React or your own custom library or whatever. So it's fine as long as HTMX embeds well. It's a low commitment library. Like you can use it for just one little piece, and it doesn't require you to make a big commitment to it. And so that's another thing that I think it has going for it is you can very easily just use it for just one small part if it just makes sense for one small part of your app.
Okay, what is your most unpopular opinion in web development? And it can't just be that Hypermedia is great and that we need to use HTMX.
Well, we could talk about REST, the meaning of the word REST. I don't
Yeah.
know if you want to go into that. I wouldn't call this my most, boy. I could also talk about fear of looking dumb. I'm going to do two. I'm sorry. I'm going to do two. Let's first talk about
Yeah,
REST,
do it.
which your listeners are probably used to REST, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. They're used to that meaning basically a JSON API, and it turns out that almost no REST APIs that are out there are actually REST in the original sense of that term. And that's because the original sense of that term included the constraint. It was not like an optional thing. Like to have a RESTful API, as Roy Fielding described in his dissertation, which is where that term comes from, you had the requirement of a hypermedia. And so that means that a JSON data API that doesn't have any hypermedia controls in it is not RESTful, sort of by definition. Unfortunately,
Hypermedia
and
being
it's
a link or a form, right?
links and forms, HTML being a hypermedia, which has the defining
Right.
characteristic of a hypermedia is the presence of hypermedia controls. And some people try to work around this by including like at link attributes or link attributes in their JSON APIs. I don't think that's worked out that well. And I've got another essay called Hypermedia Clients, where I talk about how the way the RESTful architecture of the web works requires not only a RESTful API. It's not a characteristic just of the API, but also the client and the browser implementation of what the uniform interface constraint, which is part of REST, is really important as well. And so it's funny. Like now, when we say REST, we just mean JSON over HTTP, but technically that's not correct. Now, I do not expect to change the language. It's so baked in at this point that the language around REST has been completely nuked from an originalist standpoint. But nonetheless, I think it is useful for engineers, even JSON engineers, to go back and look at the original meaning of the term and sort of the process by which that term morphed over time, because it's a really interesting history. It involves like 2 or 3 steps to get to where we got to, where we sort of flipped the meaning of REST upside down. So I'd say that's one controversial opinion that isn't just use HTMX instead of React, which you should use. But the other unpopular opinion that I'll throw out there is that a lot of, and I think this is particularly a problem in web development. I don't know about backend so much, but in web development, what I see is that a lot of decisions are driven by fear of looking dumb. People are worried about appearing unsophisticated and are unwilling to say this is too complicated and we should do something simpler, even if it's not super sexy. We should sacrifice the sexiness in favor of simplicity. And not to pick on Rich Harris, again, I think he's a very sharp guy, but I think you saw a little bit of that in his talk on Have SPAs Ruin the Web, where when he started talking about other approaches to front end development, he used terms such as sophisticated, and terms like this, where there's this the front end industry tends to lean into things like sophistication and look at something like HTMX and say that's too simple, that's too dumb to work. And so I think that fear of looking dumb, that inability to just say, look, we're doing it a simpler way, and that's it. I'm sorry. Like, it might not have all the bells and whistles of this other approach, but it's going to keep the code a lot simpler, is something that drives a lot of decisions in front end development, and in web development in general. And so I think the back end, by and large, people keep things a little simpler. And there's a little bit more of a culture of simplicity. And so maybe that is something that HTMX might appeal at some level to backend developers who have that sense of like really, really focus on keeping it simple.
Yeah, that's it. I just can't like help but picture the midwit meme. Like, you don't want to find yourself in the middle of that bell curve where no, I need to use all the fancy frameworks. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And but I don't want to be too hard on people either about it, because we work in a very, like, it's a very brutal industry. You have to keep up. There's always a new thing,
Yeah.
Even in back end, but the front end's even worse. And people have had their careers ruined by not keeping up. If you're a Perl developer, then
Right.
in 1999, and Java comes along and just nukes all of the Perl jobs, like, that hurt real bad. And so there's a legitimate fear there. I don't want to downplay that legitimate fear.
Right.
On the other hand, and this is where, and I think there's also, to be honest, that fear is taken advantage of when people push new technologies, like, oh, you're doing it the old way, you're doing it like, I get that,
Right.
a little bit
All the
with
marketing
HTMX,
material.
yeah, like, why would you do it the old way? This looks like, people come in and they're like, this looks like something from 2005, and I'm like, yep, correct. That's right. That's fine. I'm old enough now, that it doesn't bother me so much. But I'm definitely sympathetic to engineers that feel that, and I still feel it to an extent. Some new cool JavaScript thing will come out, and I'm like, oh, maybe HTMX is all wrong, and then I look into it, and I'm like, it is what it is. So I think that overcoming, particularly for senior developers, younger developers, like, it is what it is. You're going to be, uncertain about your career, and you have imposter syndrome and all the rest of it. And so that's very normal. But if senior engineers in particular at a company, people who have a secure spot in a technical organization, can say things like, hey, is there a simpler way we can do this? Like, I get it, that looks great, but is there a simpler way we can do it? And overcome that fear of looking dumb. It can be very good for an organization. You can really knock down the complexity that you're heaping into your application. And in particular, when senior engineers do it, younger engineers can take that as a cue, as a social cue. Oh, it's okay for, even if he's or she is able to say that this is too complicated, then I am also able to say that, and I won't get fired, and I won't be thought less of. So I think that's a really important cultural
Right.
marker that senior engineers in particular have an opportunity for improving things. It's a little bit of a risk, but I really think it's a good thing for senior engineers to do.
I love that you're calling that out. When you're a new developer, it can be really hard to point out something as feeling complicated, because I feel like there's just an inherent pressure on you, like an inherent self-doubt of like, does it feel complicated because it is complicated, or does it feel complicated because I lack the experience to understand why it's simple? So
Right.
that makes a lot of sense to me.
Maybe
It
I'm
also
not
sounds like
smart
you wouldn't
enough.
recommend. Right. So you wouldn't recommend that junior developers walk into their back-end developer interviews and open with, oh, you're not actually looking for a RESTful API developer.
No, we're not going to change the
Starting with the
terminology in the
actually.
industry, kids. Yeah, actually, no, I would not do that. That's another, and that's sort of the flip side of the advice to the senior engineers. For the younger engineers, like, there's the imposter syndrome, but then there's also the opposite of that, which is some young engineers, and I was like this when I was younger, will come in and just blow a code base up because this is all wrong, and
Yeah.
learning to have a little bit of humility in the face of complexity is also good. I think depending on the type of personality that you have, I certainly over my career, I write code differently now than I used to, much more defensively than I used to, and I'm also much more careful with my changes than I used to be. So that's another, but that's why you have hopefully you have senior engineers you need that interplay between those two. But by and large, I think, young engineers either fall into the imposter syndrome or way too arrogant camps. And
Yeah.
then senior engineers, they tend to, I think where they have an opportunity to really contribute to culture is that saying, okay, let's keep it simple. This is too complicated, and being a good example for the younger engineers.
Yeah, I love that advice. And in my experience, it's been, if you're pre-first job, you probably don't have a confidence problem. So like I wouldn't worry too much about that. It's usually like the 1 year of experience is like where maybe like
Right.
some of those of us, like it sounds like you were this way. I think I was this way as well. With 1 year of experience, I felt like I really started to learn a lot, and I
Yeah.
definitely needed to fall a few times in order to learn. I didn't have it all figured out.
Yep.
Cool. Carson Gross, thank you so much for coming on. Can you tell everybody where they can find HTMX, where they can find your book, and just anything else you want to point my listeners to?
Sure. So you can find HTMX at htmx.org. And my company is Big Sky Software. I'm out of Montana, so bigsky.software is the company website. Hypermedia Systems is a book. You can buy it on Amazon if you like. It's also available for free online at hypermedia.systems. And then the Twitter account, which is probably the silliest of the bunch, is you can find it at twitter.com/htmx_org. And so there's links between all those things. If you're interested in the theoretical stuff, I think rather than jumping right into the book, which you're welcome to do, of course, if it really grabs you, but the essays page on htmx.org, so htmx.org/essays, there's a series of essays kind of grouped together by overall topic, and your listeners can read through those if they're interested in sort of how I think about hypermedia.
Fantastic. Check out all those places. I will link them down in the description below, so be sure to go click those links. And again, thanks, Carson. I'll talk to you later. It was great having you on.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on, man. I really appreciate it.